Lena had always prided herself on being a good student, but this time things were different. The algebra test had been harder than she expected, and when she received her results, her heart sank. A glaring red D marked the top of the paper. She knew her mother, Mrs. Caldwell, had high expectations, and the thought of disappointing her was unbearable. So, she made a choice. A bad one. She stuffed the test paper into the bottom of her backpack, pretending it didn't exist. Maybe, just maybe, if she ignored it, the problem would disappear. For days, Lena avoided her mother's eyes and faked a smile whenever school was mentioned. She convinced herself she could keep the secret forever. But guilt gnawed at her, making her stomach twist every time she walked past her mother in the hallway. One evening at dinner, Mrs. Caldwell asked, "Lena, did you get your test results back yet?" Lena's heart pounded. No, not yet. Maybe tomorrow," she lied, keeping her head down and focusing on the peas on her plate. Mrs. Caldwell studied her daughter for a moment, her instincts kicking in. "All right, but I want to see it as soon as you get it." Lena nodded quickly, eager to move on. She thought she had gotten away with it, but the truth has a way of finding its way out. The very next day, an email from her teacher arrived in Mrs. Caldwell's inbox, detailing Lena's poor grade and her apparent decision to hide it. When Lena returned home that evening, her mother was waiting, arms crossed, test paper in hand. "Lena," Mrs. Caldwell said sternly, "do you have something to tell me?" Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She glanced at the paper and knew there was no escape. I was going to tell you," she stammered, Mrs. Caldwell's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, you weren't. You lied to me. You hid this from me. Do you have any idea how much worse that makes this?" Lena's throat tightened. "I was scared. I didn't want to disappoint you." Mrs. Caldwell exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Lena, I'm not just disappointed in your grade, I'm disappointed in your dishonesty. In this house, we don't run from our mistakes. We face them." Lena lowered her gaze, shame burning inside her. She knew her mother's disappointment was worse than any punishment, and since you chose to lie, you will face the consequences. Go to the sofa. Now. Lena swallowed hard. She knew better than to argue. With slow steps, she walked into the living room, her legs trembling slightly. The sofa loomed ahead, and she hesitated for a moment before lowering herself onto it. Mrs. Caldwell followed, sitting down beside her. "Over my lap," she instructed firmly. Lena hesitated, her face burning with embarrassment, but she obeyed, knowing there was no use in protesting. As she stretched over her mother's lap, she braced herself. The first swat landed with a sharp sting, making her gasp. Another followed, then another. Each one sent a clear message. Lying had consequences. Tears welled up in Lena's eyes as the punishment continued, her remorse growing with every swat. By the time it was over, her defiance had melted away, replaced by regret and understanding. Mrs. Caldwell set the paddle down and placed a gentle hand on her daughter's back. "I don't do this because I enjoy it. Lena, I do it because I need you to understand that honesty is always the right choice. Do you understand?" Lena wiped her eyes, nodding. "Yes, Mom. I'm sorry. I won't lie again." Her mother sighed and pulled her into a hug. "I love you, Lena. I just want you to grow into a responsible young woman. Mistakes happen, but lying only makes things worse." That night, as Lena lay in bed, she reflected on everything. The sting had faded, but the lesson remained. She promised herself that next time, no matter how scared she would tell the truth, because trust, once broken, was much harder to mend.